So with a Cloud Center of Excellence, what we're trying to achieve today is just kind of get a high-level overview of what the Cloud Center of Excellence is, why it is important to your organization, especially when we talk about modernization or migrations into the cloud. So when we look at the cloud, over the last couple of years, we have had quite a few things within the IT industry throughout its lifespan affect the IT industry, but not holistically across every avenue of the industry like cloud has, or maybe something like virtualization was maybe the last one before this when VMware came out with ESXi back in the early 2000s. And when we look at cloud as an ultimate disruptor, what we've been able to see out here is that we're seeing not only is an organization's tool stack changing, not only is their organization structural changing, we're also seeing application stacks change. We see many different components within the organization change. And so when we look at why has this been so impactful, we look at companies like Uber and Netflix that have been able to disrupt markets within by just utilizing the cloud and having this expanse to be able to leverage the public cloud to disrupt these markets by distributing their software directly to the customer at really unprecedented, kind of speed. And when we look at this, most enterprises have a lot of technical debt. So they really have foot in two worlds, but these new companies that are coming up and are very cloud native, they always are going to have this leg up of this agility because they've built out into the cloud. So you have this existing core business databases and internal applications that you're trying to get into the cloud, but then you have to kind of modernize them at the same time or lean on the providers of those applications. So when we look at this, it's very disruptive, especially to operations, keeping the lights on, and many other components within your business as you're trying to make this journey, because it is going to be very much a hybrid journey until you get fully invested into the cloud. Well, when we look at why many organizations are going to the cloud, there's a lot of different reasons why. It could be as simple as my CEO told me to go to the cloud. It could be different things such as, they need a quicker agility in the development department. You have urgent capacity needs, or you might just have seasons throughout the year where you need burstability of resources, but don't necessarily need those resources all year long. We also see some other major components being, integration in for mergers and acquisitions, or we see maybe a contract expiring or equipment coming up at end of life, and people are kind of doing this analysis of saying, where does it make sense for us to move into the cloud, or what does it make sense to move into the cloud, and when does it become cost prohibitive for us to move into the cloud? And so when we look at these different reasons of why you are thinking about moving to the cloud, it's a good question to ask. Why are we moving? What is it that's driving us to the cloud? And understanding that drive so that when you're communicating this out with a CCOE, be able to really clearly articulate to your organizations things that you might not have thought about or have prepared for. And that's where a lot of this Cloud Center of Excellence comes in. So when we look at this and we talk about this transformation of, going from a traditional IT shop to modernizing it, or really changing of your application stacks, or modernizing your operational models, this transformation really requires a lot of organizational change. It is a cultural shift. And that's a huge change for organizations. It's sometimes probably the hardest change an organization can ever experience. And so when we look at this, we're really trying to figure out how do we go about doing this in a very easy transitional way. And that's where the CCOE comes in. We look at that CCOE, or the Cloud Center of Excellence, as a key to success. But what is a Cloud Center of Excellence? A Cloud Center of Excellence is nothing more than a cross-functional team of people that are really trying to drive the strategy, the governance, the best practices for your organization, making sure that people across your different silos or stacks or teams, however you have your organization structured, are all in alignment with what is priority. A lot of times what we end up seeing in customers and conversations that are coming out of this is that the IT group is pushing for this, or another component of the organization is pushing for it, but it's not priority to everybody. And when you have these competing priorities, you're not going to have a lot of things really go smoothly or have a very good successful transition to the cloud. And that's where that CCOE comes in and helps drive that alignment across these different technology verticals or team verticals. However it's structured, it's a lot of times where we see organizations that are really struggling with understanding what it is that they're trying to do, aligned across those different groups. So why is a CCOE vital to success to running into the cloud? It's going to help with breaking down those barriers, making sure that those groups are in lockstep, making sure that there is a good strategic view, as well as prioritization to the things that are going on. And so you need that alignment across your company to establish those guardrails for processes, governance standards, and controls, as well as really just getting more mature in the cloud. And as that cultural shift happens, you are going to hit some bumps in the road. You're going to have a lot of finger pointing of people going back and forth saying, this isn't my responsibility, or this isn't, one of the things that is supposed to be happening right now. And somebody's got to be able to answer that at a high level to understand what is going to be priority, what is going to be happening in your organization at that time, and really being that, I like to equate it as like the Supreme Court justices of our political system. They are kind of that final answer of saying what is really actionable, what is going to be whose responsibility, and stuff of that nature. A lot of times CCOEs have nothing very much technical that goes into them. It is a lot of times comprised of stakeholders from security, development, human resources, business process owners that might be key businesses processes, and when we look at this is something that is not normal for a lot of times when we see these transitions. So when we see this is why we say it has to be a cross-functional team. It can't just be IT. It just can't be development. It has to be a lot of different groups within the organization working together. So why is that important? A lot of times when we see the organizations moving into the cloud, they don't utilize the full leverage or the full potential of the cloud. And so when there are these common concerns, that's where that CCOE can kind of come in and put out there, what is that goal that we're going to reach to? What is it that we're measuring when we're trying to get to the cloud? What is success to us as defined as an organization? And what we end up seeing is when people put those things out there and they communicate this information out to their organization, we see a lot of times migration processes become smoother. Finance being a part of that CCOE is very instrumental to success because there is going to be these fluctuations in pricing. And as a financial group, you got to remember that's going to bring a lot of anxiety to them, especially when they don't know that it's predictive cost. There is to a point where you can predict a lot of the things, but there is still varying costs that you just can't control, such as egress charges, as well as crosstalk, or even other charges of consumption models based on what some of the tools you might be using in the cloud. And so it also, as the last component of this, really provides the enterprise a lot of structure to move faster than what they might have typically thought if they didn't have this. And speaking from experience of having led a couple organizations to the cloud, I've seen that be successful without a CCOE, but I haven't seen it as successful as I have with a CCOE. I've actually had times where I've actually had to pull back because we didn't have a CCOE. And so we were trying to drive something from one aspect of the organization, which is where I came from on the IT side, but development wasn't ready, or we didn't know that some of the requirements that they had, and that drove us back. And we've seen anything even go from, pricing of $75,000 a month to $230,000 in the next month. And that control wasn't in place because we didn't have alignment across the different organizations, and people were just going out and spending or consuming things that maybe they weren't prepared for, and we didn't have the proper parameters put in place, where that CCOE could have helped us alleviate some of those issues before they actually happened. Well, I talk a little bit about a cultural shift. The cultural shift when we talk about moving to the cloud is something that is enormous for an organization. IT has traditionally always been this control or the limiting factor of how organizations got out to production And a lot of times we've even seen that bifurcated out into DevOps groups or anything like that, where DevOps or development was actually controlling some of the production stuff that was customer facing. But what we're seeing is in this cultural shift is IT has always been this control, but with what we're trying to go into in the cloud is an enablement and a support. And that really changes how IT approaches moving to the cloud. And because of this, what we're seeing is that we're needing to put guardrails in place. Instead of it being this controlling fashion, we need to put lanes up so that people can kind of pick and choose whatever exit that they need to get off at, but they never have to stop and have IT be a part of that process. So when we see a successful CCOE model, it really enables that cultural shift in IT to change into being more of an enabler instead of being a control factor. And so that's where we see that control and that shift really being painstaking for a lot of organizations, because it is such a drastic change. And that's why we have to see a CCOE in place to kind of help with really a lot of that organizational change that's going to happen. It's not that people are going to lose jobs, but what's going to end up happening is people's roles change. And when you start changing people's roles, that really brings a lot of anxiety. And I can speak to that personally, having known an organization that I took public, it was to the public cloud. What ended up happening was a lot of people got very scared about their roles because they were like, well, if we're not going to have any IT infrastructure, what am I going to do? And these storage admins that maybe had been there for 20-something years and doing only storage had to change their roles into doing something more aligned with a business process in addition to what they were doing with storage, even for the cloud on a cloud ops model. Now, when we look at this in this old model of this enforcement and control, this is where development and operations really sat on two sides of the fence. But what we're trying to do is develop out this, what we've coined as the term as DevOps. But really what I'm seeing even further now is that we're starting to see security involved in this as well, to have DevSecOps, where they're sharing control of account structures, cost management, policies, catalogs, security, account management, all kinds of different things that go into really putting in a good cloud operating model to enable users to be able to be self-sufficient and be able to drive your organization from being a traditional IT shop into more of a practice that's aligned with your business and being more in lockstep with what's going on, enabling users to be quicker at maybe deploying more application stacks or net new features to the organization, so that their organization is being able to be a lot more agile to what's going on in the business and being, instead of being necessarily reactive, but being more proactive in how they might approach their end users. So the Cloud Center of Excellence really comes into play here with really helping with DevOps, SecOps, FinOps, and CloudOps. These net new organizational structures is something that's quite new to a lot of people, especially around FinOps. A lot of times it's always been, hey, we need to buy these goods. And it's been very much a transactional. We put it on an amortization schedule for your infrastructure. But what we're ending up seeing is that with a Cloud Center of Excellence and going to the cloud, finance is really needing to have a little bit more insight about what's going on. Additionally, with some of the features that you get with cloud, they're able to even get more granular in what it is that costs or what it is have a run rate for an organization. And the more information that they get out of it, a lot of times we're seeing them to want even more information out of the system, which makes it something where they need to be in lockstep with the groups to ensure that net new policies are putting in or tagging strategies so that they can get more analysis or more granular in their focus when they're talking about finances or the cost of run an application stack. Cloud Ops, it's just what it sounds like. It talks about how the operations group from IT transitions into Cloud Ops. That's what they're going to be really doing, but they're working with the DevOps teams and the SecOps teams to establish those guardrails, putting in monitoring or compliance things or utilization, shared services within the organization, so that they can really ensure that the organization is going to be able to do what they need to do as they're moving into the cloud. That CCOE can really hold those groups accountable and help drive that change as those groups and teams are kind of adjusting or being reformed in your organization. And they collect that feedback to then maybe make reiterations and help with driving that cloud maturity model. So once all this happens, we're able to kind of establish a lot of this out there, and then they can start really enacting on that and really running with it, and then really do a lot of give and take. And so that's why we see CCOEs being very important as they're going into the cloud. It needs to be part of that whole strategy before you even begin the journey, to sit down and start saying, how's this going to impact us and what are the things that we need to do? So where does that leave the CCOE's responsibilities? That leads them with, working across these net new 4 teams, but it helps with the standardizing of tooling. It helps with the standardizing of accountability across the organization. It helps with giving guidance around policies and telling groups that, hey, you guys need to come up with these new landing zones or structure or the frameworks that you need to put in to the cloud to start with a great foundation. And so with this, what we end up seeing is a lot of waste or things that could be identified that maybe we need to change application stacks. And that's where, again, the CCOE can kind of come in and help these organizations kind of make decisions instead of operating in a silo like they traditionally might have in a traditional IT shop or company. So when we look at this and we look at how do we facilitate this collaboration and acceleration for innovation, it really has to have one group across all of them that kind of helps meld all of these together so that you can ensure that your organization will move into the cloud and be successful. We talk a little bit about that tool strategy, and what we're talking about in that, we wanted to call that out as a lot of times organizations, even within them, will have different tools for different groups. With this, what we're trying to really urge is that groups utilize the same tool set so that there is some synergies running across these. And when you have competing groups trying to choose a tool, as we all know, it's something that can be very illustrious or something very hard to kind of come down to one commonality. But we got to figure out what that 80-20 rule is. And when we look at these tool sets, this is kind of some of the top ones that we've been seeing across a lot of these different groups. And this is something that we're going to continue to see expand, and even beyond what some of these are up here, it's even beginning to change even as we look today. And so when we look at this, it really helps with understanding what is going across your organization, standardizing across all these different stacks, and really maybe even looking into an agile process or even code pipelines so that you're changing maybe even your SDLC. Maybe your development groups already changed their SDLC and they're already doing an agile. That's really hard for a lot of IT shops because there's still a lot of antiquated technology that might be being utilized within a corporation. And that is that challenge that where the CCOE's got to kind of help balance with IT. How do we take some of these legacy applications and look at their migration processes and maybe look at what is the options that you might have for each one of those application stacks to say, does this tool make sense, or do we need to upgrade it, or do we need to retire it? There's quite a few options there. And if I really urge you to go out and maybe look up what the 6 R's are, it's very well documented out there in the industry. Well, when we get into the CCOE and how do we define what is good, define what good looks like, we look at a very traditional process of the CMMI model, and we've seen that morph into what we now call the cloud maturity model. Well, every organization is always trying to strive to get better and better. Well, where do you try to take that practice? Well, that's where we look at this model and we say, this is what we feel is a good place to start. And again, this isn't something necessarily that is defined by SHI. This is a really known practice in the industry with the CCOE. If you go out and look at AWS, GCP, or Azure, all 3 of them will have a lot of documentation around a CCOE. However, a lot of them don't necessarily get into what is defining what is good. They're all going to have their own practices because they all have their own best practices. But what we've seen as a collaborative effort across all the organizations out there is that this model here really helps define what is that industry standard. And this is the model that we try to achieve when we're trying to help organizations move up this scale or this ladder into a more mature model. So when we look at, now that we know kind of where that definition of good sits, what we're trying to do is really sit down with organizations and say, when you look at what is in a CCOE, it really has 12 different areas that has focal points or foundational points that we're trying to put focus on. I recognize that there's 13 things on here. The first one being stakeholder identification, just kind of list out who should be a part of the CCOE. The remainder 12 are what the functional topic areas that we're going to be talking about in a CCOE. And so if we were to look at what is entailed in each one of these, it can get really big. And so that's why we try to keep it as simple as possible, especially in conversations like this. But when we look at what is in a CCOE, you can see that there's quite a bit of different things that needs to be discovered or discussed at a CCOE level to kind of help put guidance and structure around your organization so that everybody's kind of in lockstep. And just any one of these, if we were to look at it, breaks out into many different topic areas and those functional areas. And that's where SHI can really come in and assist. And that's why we see this as such an important thing to do within an organization, especially when you're migrating to the cloud, because this is a lot to contemplate. There's a lot of different things within each one of these components. And because of that, it warrants the time and effort needed to have those discussions around it to ensure that everybody's in lockstep. So where does that put SHI, and how do we help you out with this practice? Well, when we look at this, this is something that we really want to make sure people understand. It's really a gap analysis that we really come in and first can really help out with this. And this is, again, maybe you remember we were just talking about the cloud maturity model, it comes back into play. And so what you would maybe expect from a partner is that, hey, come in, tell us where we sit today in alignment with the cloud maturity model, and score it across these different kind of categories. When we talk about that being a vision, alignment, implementation, and operations, and we go into each one of those 12 areas that we saw in the mind map. And what we talk about within that component is each one of those at depth. We talk about interviewing, trying to understand where your organization is. And then what we can do is come back after we go through these different functional topic areas and kind of discuss them, is give you kind of a feedback model of, hey, this is where you land. This is where we see you today based off of this assessment or this gap analysis when we take a look at it comparatively to that cloud maturity model. And so this really gives organizations a way to kind of say what is important to us that we need to get kind of done first, or you can work with a partner such as like SHI to figure out what it is that you need to be doing or what things you might want to put focus on. And that's one of the other things that we like to try to, kind of give out to these organizations is, hey, here is your current state in the gray line, but for you to get to this future state, this is where we really suggest you putting, really heavy emphasis on these specific sections, especially maybe around hybrid cloud or roles and responsibility, but not necessarily deployment. Sometimes it just depends on where your organization is at, what it is that you're struggling with, and what it is that you're trying to get to. So when we look at this, this is kind of the model that we follow here at SHI, but this is, again, we're taking in all the things that we've seen from AWS, Azure, GCP, as we've worked with them and many other organizations out there that we've done this with already to help them guide, and we can do that any kind of level where you might need assistance or you might have just even questions. Reach out to one of our reps, and that's where we can really help out with just trying to start getting that discussion going or even diving deeper into a CCOE. And so as we wrap up here, the last thing I just want to explain is why is SHI as your digital transformation partner? There's something that as a previous IT operations director, I found that was very important is, yeah, there's a lot of people that can help with transitions to the cloud, or maybe they're just Azure specific or they're just AWS specific. That's where SHI really can be that transformational partner. We work with all the major cloud providers out there, all three of them. We have the right partnerships with on-premise cloud hardware vendors. We have the ability to help you with purchasing, even in the marketplace, to get discounted pricing from what you see in the marketplaces. And that's where that CCOE can have that partner in this to kind of help with really ensuring that maybe you might have legacy gear that is not near end of life, but you need to move to the cloud. We can have those conversations with those hardware vendors because we work with them day in and day out. And then on top of that, we have the foundational experience or the technical expertise, however you want to look at it, to really give you that guidance based off of what we've seen out there, based off of the operational look that we really take instead of a platform look as many of the other vendors or the cloud providers are doing today. And because of that, we can really help you transform those services and get into maybe accelerating those things by helping you with the CCOE, but not only stopping there, but even migration processes, landing zones, things that put in governance and structure in your place, or even helping you with maybe where you're at today existingly. But again, all this feeds up into that CCOE and that reiterative rate of coming back and forth with them to understand, hey, where's my organization? Do we need to adjust? The market's adjusting. We need to make adjustments. All these things are always kind of a living, breathing thing that's constantly going on. And that's why we see the CCOE being such a key to success when moving to the cloud. And with that, we'll stop there. Any questions? First one is this an industry practice or SHI initiative? Again, I didn't cover this really well. The CCOE is definitely an industry practice. Again, it is something that is really across all the major cloud providers out there, not just limited to the three. If you look at Gartner, any of the other Forrester organizations that do a lot of publications, you will see that they have a lot of discussions around this. It is something that they see as very important. And I came from a realm where we did have previous cloud before the CCOE came into fruition. And I can tell you that having done it without a CCOE and doing it with a CCOE, it's a way easier. And that's why we see that. And that's why we're really trying to help organizations at least understand it. And that's why we're trying to do a lot of these technical briefings to get people educated. If you are going to do a technical briefing, our suggestion is to really ensure that you're not only bringing in your IT group, but bring in your security groups, bring in the development groups, bring in your finance, maybe even your HR group, because when you're talking about that cultural shift, a lot of different groups need to be involved in that, and there needs to be alignment across the organization. Next question, how does CCOE prevent shadow IT? When you're getting out there, it doesn't necessarily prevent shadow IT, but what it does is it brings awareness to organizations that allow for them to know kind of across all of them that, hey, y'all need to quit going off and doing your own thing. We're trying to form one group here to put alignment across our organization to ensure that, hey, we're going to be able to do this. We're going to do it in a manner that you will be able to consume the product and that you won't need to go out and do shadow IT. You can put other preventative things out there to help prevent that, just so you're aware. Work with your cloud providers to do that. They can prevent certain things. There's also some other steps that even organizations like SHI can help partner with you on to kind of help prevent some of those things or locks on the cloud environment so that people don't necessarily do that. What do we get from the CCOE? It goes back to one of those slides that we were talking about, alignment across your organization. That's the big thing. But a tangible is that you really end up getting, when you're working with a partner like SHI, is that gap analysis and understanding that, hey, where you stand today, it's some documentation that comes out of it. We even put in next steps and strategies and recommendations. We can even go one step further and be like a Sherpa or a guide and bring in people to actually drive those conversations. What is the end result of a CCOE assessment? It goes back to, again, same thing, those recommendations. It comes into those that document that I was showing you, this kind of the slides. I only showed you a short synopsis of the slides. There's actually a long, long list of it because it goes through each one of those 12 different areas in the mind map, and we'll actually touch on each one of those subjects and get into recommendations for each one of them. Who comprises the CCOE? We can actually pull that one up real quick if we were to pull that up. A lot of times this is who we see in CCOEs. And going through this list, when we see InfoSec, it's just because security needs to be part of every discussion, especially when it has stuff that has capabilities of intellectual property being exposed to the public, or just any kind of protections around your infrastructure that you might need to have. Legal, a lot of times we recommend having legal in there because there is some things that are changing as far as contract, maybe with stuff that's going on as far as net new tool strategies. Other reasons that we see legal sometimes involved in this is maybe whatever contracts y'all might have with existing customers. If you're a SaaS house, that you need to be cognizant of. Is there anything in our contract language that might prevent us from moving to the cloud? Infrastructure obviously really has to be doing a lot of the bulk of the work as far as the frameworks and the governance and control, making sure that those things are in place, so that those guardrails are in place and that organizations are going to stay within predefined areas, as well as controlling that cost. Finance, you're going from a CapEx model to an OpEx model. That's a big change for them. You got to make sure that there's alignment there. You got to make sure that budgets, a lot of times budgets isn't the problem, but it's the fluctuation of budgets and really trying to predict that cost or that spend that's going to be going into the cloud. Again, we talked about business units. It's maybe not every business unit needs to be involved, but any key processes, and maybe they come into the CCOE for a short term, or different units come in at different times, so that they get understanding, they feel part of the initiative. Again, this is driving alignment across your organization so that you have lockstep groups instead of it being silos. The next one is human resources. Anytime you're talking about changing people's roles, you need to have human resources involved. A lot of times what we see also human resources involved is for communication strategies across the organization when you're talking about multiple teams and being involved. We also see certification processes or training exercises, as well as maybe even bringing in people to talk about the role changes and what's going on there. And then obviously development being the last one. A lot of times what we see with that is we want to make sure that we're enabling development to be even quicker or more agile. And so we need their input. Plus, the most common thing I see, and the reason I see development coming in is purely because I've had this personal experience where I was in the IT group. I would go to development and say, hey, we need to do this in the cloud. And they would tell me it's not priority for them. And when it's not priority for them, I can't make them do something, or it becomes so painstaking for us that there's a lot of conflict or a lot of rubbing. And because of that, we wanted to make sure the development's in there and they understand what is the priorities, and it's being driven from a top down, not from a bottom up kind of initiative. Back to questions. I don't see anything else. And with that, no other questions. I'd like to say thank you for your time today, and I hope y'all all have a wonderful day.